Welcome everybody at the TAXISPALAIS to the second Stories of Time or Zeitgeschichten gatherings. And it's really an immense pleasure and honor to have two such distinguished, unconventional thinkers here today. Rosalyn D'Mello and, applause, definitely. And Elizabeth A. Povinelli. So I am it's hard to believe. I'm really happy about this. Let me start a bit from how this gathering took shape from, or where they were drawn from. They came as a complement to an exhibition that we had here last year, and which was the third part of a trilogy on the crisis of Western paradigms. And in the last chapter, called Zeitgeschichten or Stories of Time, we, or the artist, tackled the question like the two main pillars of Western thinking, which is progress and linearity. And all the pitfalls, all the inequalities, all the devastating effects on humans, but also on the planet itself and everyone. We know them all very well. So the artists were had two vantage points. One was to analyze and dissect the pitfalls and the problems in the system, and some of them also dared to think alternative models. The same goes for these gatherings that I invited Siddhartha Lokanandi to co-organize together with me, and he would have loved to be with us today, but unfortunately this time it won't be possible. But of course he'll see your talks afterwards, and and we all get together at some point. So Siddhartha and I were thinking how to invite, as I said, unconventional thinkers, and also contribute our little mini part in proposing couplings of unconventional couplings of thinkers that you probably would not find in a purely academic context. I mean, you find all of these people in a purely academic context, but here people meet and respond spontaneously also to each other, that maybe won't be invited at the same conference, or maybe it's even not true, but let's see. So we started also to think which terms do we have, because I think it gets very obvious if you look at a term, an Hindustani term, so one that is used in Hindi and Urdu, which is kal, and which is designates both yesterday and tomorrow. Or we also introduced a Farsi term in this discussion, which is hall, which includes things of the present moment as also one that is full of mood. So where the temper of the moment is part of the second itself. Just to hint to the fact that a Western time thinking is, of course, very contingent one, and all our speakers so far decided also in their books and also in the talks here, they start with an I, but not this uninteresting I, not to be confounded with the German-speaking ich, because there's too much Freud in it, there's too much individual in it, and I would say the I that both Shahram Khosravi, Wazira Zaminda, who were the guests of the first part, and today Rosalyn D'Mello and Bess Povinelli, they say this I in order to grasp the bigger, the larger political, socio-political context. But all of these people would say, or they just practice in their thinking, that you cannot talk about universal things. It does not make sense. It always turns out wrong. It turns out destructive and has devastating effects. So they situate themselves. They say where they are talking, from which perspective, from which vantage point they can speak. Where does their knowledges come from? This is pointed out in all these discourses, and I think it's one first step to think temporalities and different kind of temporalities in an adequate manner. I'm sure I forgot a lot of things, but we have a whole afternoon together, so I think we don't have to worry about this. Let me just maybe also summarize for you the first gathering so that we know how it continues today, or on which ground maybe we are also discussing. The last time, Shahram Khosravi, who is an anthropologist teaching at the Stockholm University, was discussing time as a possibility to talk about displacement. He chose the lens of waiting to discuss how waiting differs for different people, and that if one might say that all of us know waiting, then we have to clearly differentiate different kinds of waiting, different contexts of violence also. So it's not the same, of course, to wait for a bus or for a visa. So he was very diagnostic. He analyzed the current situation. And Wazira Zaminda talked about the time of love. So she did it in a different way than you will speak about love, Beth. She somehow dared to think of an alternative time. And what she proposed came actually from something that she wanted to hand over to her sons. So also very personal. And it was a very complex talk, and I hope I don't say anything that she would not like. But I would say this, how she defined the time of love would be a time where there is place for differences, where love can happen through and with differences, where love force is a political one. It's not only a feeling, rather an attitude, and it also came to this very nice saying that she said she wants the right to belong as a stranger. And this will be also the third part of our trilogy that we have here, so she will co-curate it together with me. So this was last time. This time we have Rosalyn D'Mello, who will talk. I would say that both of you actually do both. You have the diagnostic chapter, but you also touch to maybe alternative models without really spelling them out. Like you are sharing somehow your quest for the alternative models, and you also share with us why we need to look for them. So Rosalyn D'Mello talks about, as she called it in her abstract, immigrant maternal time. I won't say more because we will have the chance to listen to yourself. And Bess Povinelli will go back to a book. We asked her actually to go back to a book that she published in 2002, Empire of Love. So from the title, there are some overlappings with Wazira, but I think you discuss it in a very different way. And the title of her talk is Tense Aspect and the Mood of Love. And I expect that you talk about different tenses of love. We will have, as I said, a lot of breaks so that we can be all really concentrated and focused during the talks. We will start with Rosalyn D'Mello now, then we have a short drink break, then we have the talk by Elizabeth Povinelli, afterwards a soup, and then when we are all strong, then we can come to the response session where you two respond to your things, and I will also sit next to you. Rosalyn D'Mello did a lot of things, like as you could also read in the things in our abstract. She's a feminist writer, an art critic, a columnist, an essayist, and researcher. She has done many things in many different contexts. At the moment, she's teaching gender equality at the university in Bolzano. And she is writing, so we have now really the privilege to listen to a book that will be published in the future and maybe in the near future. She calls it herself an essay beast, and I would completely agree from the parts that I had already read. An essay beast, milking time, and we are very curious to hear what you have to say. A big applause for Rosalyn.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's really exciting to be here because the last time I was here visiting Innsbruck, I just came because I'd always somehow missed Nina's exhibitions or didn't come in time, and I was like, I'm going to make it for this one. And I was like, I wanted to review it. I was lucky that she had time to meet me. And I had my child with me who suddenly got so tired from traveling across the Alps from Tirol to here and just really wanted to sleep. And Nina was like, so wonderful, as was her staff, making sure that he was fine and I was fine, and I got him to nap, and now suddenly I'm here, giving this lecture, so it's really quite serendipitous. I mean, one of the lovely things that happened was that we had a chance to be vulnerable with each other, and I really remember that experience. And then I think you read my essay, and then I just felt so held by you across the distance when we messaged each other and talked about it. And then it's exciting because here I'm talking with, Elizabeth. And when I moved to Tirol 3 years ago in 2020, I basically looked for whatever work I could find, like apple harvesting, babysitting, library cataloging, because suddenly it felt like my English made no sense in like this bilingual context. And I reached out to a lot of people looking for work, like intellectual work that could, so I could also sustain that part of me. And one of the most exciting projects I had done at that time was worked on as a proofreader on a reader called More Than Human. And it was really wonderful because that's how I was introduced to Elizabeth's writing. And I remember at that time reading this essay and going to my partner and going like, this is just so mind-blowing. This is like brilliant. And I mean, it's a really fabulous reader. I recommend everyone to pick up a copy because it has a wonderful, wonderful selection of people. So it's also an honor I feel like I've arrived in a certain way. I shared with Nina this essay that I wrote, which was called Milking Time. The editor one of the editors at Camera Austria had asked me if I would like to contribute something to this family issue that they were doing, and it was going to come out in March. And she was like, "You'd be perfect for it. I just let you do whatever you want to write about it." And I was so busy in that first few weeks of January, which was when the deadline was looming. Doing a day job, I work as an editor with the Sharjah Art Foundation. And then I also teach at the University of Bolzano, and I also take on other work. I also work as a columnist, so it's like really intense. And this is all alongside being a full-time mother, because I work from home. So the only way I could really write this essay was in between when my child was sleeping. And in the beginning, I tried to write it sitting on my laptop, and then I found that what was taking over in me constantly was the need to follow an idea or research an idea, or if I thought, oh, okay, I want to quote this thing by Sarah Manguso, I need to find the exact thing that she said, and then I would kind of lose time searching for these references and citations. And I realized quickly that this was not a viable way of writing. The only way it made sense for me to write was to take my ink pen, and at that moment, for the first time after I'd had him, I washed my ink pen, I filled fresh, it's a Lamy pen, I filled this fresh crystal ink in it. And I was like, okay, this is it, And my partner, who works in administration for a company, had brought home stationery from there, like these little cards, and I used the back of them, and I just started writing on these cards. I was like, okay, the moment he fell asleep, I would just start scribbling and writing, and just like, I'm not changing anything, I'm not editing anything, I'm not going to improve on the sentences. The idea is not to write poetry, or something that's profound and poetic. The idea was to write, just to get it out of me and to kind of reconnect with my own subjectivity. So that happened, and in the span of that 1 week, I wrote a bunch of these cards, and then one day again when he was sleeping, on the day of my deadline, I sat on the computer and then I transcribed everything, and it was 4,500 words that I had written in the span of that 1 week. And it really felt like a collection, I was collecting. And it was about milking time because I was doing all the thinking while I was breastfeeding or putting him to sleep. So I was really trying to get as much as I could out of time, So to me, this felt like a really nice title because on the one hand, the breastfeeding was creating the opportunity for thought. And on the other hand, it was also an active verb, I was milking time. So it became interesting. And after I wrote the essay, which has been published by Camera Austria, so you can read the first part there, I just decided to continue. So every week, I do these kind of weekly dispatches, and I continued again on these pieces of paper. And at the end of the week, I just put them together and I write on a card, okay, week 1, week 2. And I write from Monday to that next Sunday, that's the week. And now I have this whole book which has grown in size, which is just this handwritten paper. And it's interesting, it's exciting. I forget often what I've written. And it is a beast because it's just kind of become this really unwieldy thing. So for today, I decided to read from week 4. My plan is to write over 39 weeks because I had my child in me for 39 weeks, so I thought it would be nice to kind of mimic that period of gestation. So I'm going to read from week 4, which was from February 13th to 19th, 2023. Okay. Though I have little control over the form and content of this unwieldy missive, this exegesis that is somehow rooted in my mundane, I learned this week as I struggle to milk time that it is not a chronicle or a journal. I'm not interested in accessing whatever space it has come to occupy within my consciousness as a site for ranting, venting, or even processing my everyday. I'm not interested in recording every detail of my quotidian, nor am I invested in evolving a memoir that will hold time still or be a still life account of my week. The 7-day containment feels more like a method of preparation, and it reminds me, or perhaps stems from an idea I once had, to write durationally alongside an event. I wanted to set a starter doe and write across the span of its evolution into a mother. I have since years been fascinated by the lure of inhabiting interspecies time, going beyond the linearity of the chromonormative and incorporating the multitudinous dimensions within which these manifest. What is the breath span of yeast, for instance, or the life cycle of a grain of mustard that is rescued from the kitchen container and sown in mud? I often used seeding and fermentation as remedial strategies, ways of circumventing the violence of bureaucratic time. Some days ago, during one of our strolls through Tramin, as I was lamenting my inability to milk time because of this alignment of Jay's regression with my ongoing mystery pains, I speculated about what I would have written had I the luxury of vacant time, and I felt unsure. I knew I didn't necessarily want to transcribe word for word the goings on in my brain. I don't want this missive to take on a stream of consciousness turn. At the same time, I've come to embrace the suspension of my agency in the actual business of writing, because I simply cannot predict the tenor, length, and semantics of the sentences. Is this what it could mean to truly let myself happen? It is institutionally and canonically assumed that a work of art inherits its status as such through the gesture of intentionality. But what about all the housewifely, magical, and mystical arts that exist outside of intention, that has or assumes meaning beyond the realm of art history? I suddenly remembered one visit to the Dargah at Nizamuddin when I watched, riveted, unable to look away, a woman guide her body into a state of possession. It was otherworldly. She was touching her body in a rhythmic, deliberate way, like someone seasoned in this form of transubstantiation, all the while uttering words, chanting, proceeding steadily into a state of ecstasy. It was processual. She took her time. She was totally and completely oblivious to the fact that she might be observed. She was not alone. She was in an area that seemed to be occupied primarily by non-male worshippers. She inhabited the space in which she was facilitating her body's flight. She was among hundreds, and yet she seemed to belong entirely to herself. As I revisited this memory, I thought back to my very bodily experience with Clarice Lispector's Agua Viva, both before and after I gave birth. I remember at the hour of Jay's birth, as half my body was anesthetized and it was past 9:30, and he had been taken into another room with B. B is my partner, and I was alone in the theater full of bilingual surgeons who were reassembling my bodily organs, and I was trying to align my breathing with the blood pressure monitor that was constantly recording my body's response to whatever it was going through. And I wondered if Agua Viva was in fact a book about giving birth. I'd lost track of how many times Lispector's narrator is either about to be born, or is being born, or will have been born, and how they seek to be always placental, somehow existing in relation to fetus and hosting body. It was in Agua Viva that I came upon this expression, to let oneself happen. And it has haunted me since, inscribing itself as some sort of mission statement for my being and consciousness. What could it mean to write like that? To be so raw, sensual, fibrous, to exist constantly within the crescendo of the instant now, to float eternally in a state of flow. When I first read the first few pages of an orange-colored copy of Henry Miller's Sexes under the arches at Fort in Bombay when I was 19 or 20, just like that, almost by chance or accident, I remember feeling within my body a monumental aliveness. What is this beastly feeling? I had to know. And so I bargained and bought the book, and everything changed, irrevocably, the way everything had when I first encountered Jeanette Winterson's Oranges Are Not the Only Fruit. That language could be so vitalized, so foamy and spirited, and make you feel possessed. Making my way through Plexus and Nexus, I had the feeling Miller was continually chasing that ephemeral moment when he felt in transmission, in harmony with some sort of divinity. Like when you try to find a frequency and then suddenly it presents itself in clarity, and you hear Alf, the ancient river, and bathe in its sacred waters. I thought back to my interview with Yasmin Jahan Nupur in her studio in Dhaka, Bangladesh. She was sitting on the same chair she'd made back in 2012, the same chair upon which I had first seen her at the Shilpa Kala Academy, to which she had herself tethered and perched upon a great height from one of the columns. She told me it was among her first explorations of long durational performance, and said the great revelation was simply how her experience of her body in time and space felt altered when she went beyond the amount of time she would ordinarily have sat perched on a chair on a height. At some point, her body must have felt one with the chair. I have a memory of asking her how she prepared for this, but I have to consult my transcripts for her answer. Dwelling on this made me re-examine the concept of artistic practice, tracing back to a long-standing question about how a writer's consciousness gets embedded within their body, which I haven't been able to answer. But I wondered, or let's say I found a way to advance the hypothesis that all forms of artistic practice are linked to muscularity. To practice is to exercise certain muscles that are intrinsic to the act of creation. I don't yet know what these might be. I know that having the aptitude, or rather my self-training with both typing and longhand writing, have framed my ability to write and deliver to deadline. 2 years during which I wrote 3 art stories a day when I was an editor at Art Info helped me to better navigate what a journalistic story arc could look like within a compressed logic and time frame. Typing really fast helped me to transcribe recordings or even live sessions as they unfolded. All the hours I spent transcribing the lectures in psychology class in undergrad, then rewriting them afresh in a separate book, allowed me to practice my longhand. In many ways, my writing practice is the direct outcome of forced resilience in the face of precarity. How did I manage my insane deadlines while being professionally prolific? I didn't have a choice. I wanted to sustain a writing practice, and I learned early enough that for me, it was premised on being autonomous. Daytime jobs that required me to show up at regular times daily were a no-go. They obstructed my rhythm and interfered with the possibility of accessing the state of transmission. Maintaining a freelance career that could be viewed as financially viable was filled with too many precarities. But it was my only option if I wanted to indulge my political and writerly agency. I still feel envy when I follow the lives of writers I know who have the privilege of working from a home for which they do not have to pay rent, either because they come from generational wealth or have spouses to support them. Still, I think of what our friend Peter once asked me. If I had suddenly access to a steady stipend that covered all my living expenses, requiring me not to do any extraneous work beyond writing, would I accept it? I found myself in a quandary because I now know that my writing self is so enriched by my massive portfolio of other work assignments, I would be all the poorer without them. And by I mean my imagination, because it derives its tensileness, its muscularity from this forced resilience. I would have to reorient my practice, perhaps totally in the light of these new conditions. I'm too afraid to find out what I might lose in this process. And do I still have time? Yeah? Okay, then I read quickly from week 5, which is very short because I didn't manage to milk so much time. It's February 20th to 26th. I have come to fear my irrepressibility. The absence of time or unfruitful attempts at finding time because of Jay's resistance to naps, my ongoing backache, and the obligation to learn German and Italian alongside full-time work makes it impossible for me to prioritize this project of rendering my subjectivity, allowing it to assume tangible material form. All day and night, I fantasize about the simple act of putting pen to paper, guiding the cursive frenzy, and unloading whatever my consciousness deems worthy of articulating. But the fear of being interrupted obstructs my flow. I'm terrified of getting into details, beginning a sentence I may not be able to finish, or narrating a memory I won't be able to delve into. I feel fated to navigate the interstices of superficial thoughts and ideas because swimming deeper threatens to cast me ashore. Adding pasta into boiling water for an 8-minute span is suspense-filled. I am alone in my in-laws' apartment where Jay is asleep in B's old room. What if he wakes up within the span? Do I take the pot off the heat? Do I simply pick him up and forego the possibility of bridging his nap? Do we eat a super al dente pasta with leftover bone and soupe? Motherhood is marked by all these anxieties. It's impossible to have total peace of mind or to enact a state of calmness when you feel you're constantly grappling for time. Being an immigrant mother, it feels almost audacious to think of myself as someone who seeks to belong to time, or to be in time, or to feel entitled to time. I watch the other mothers go about their errands in big cars with fancy strollers, often letting their kids sleep in the car or during walks. 2 minutes before the pasta could be done, Jay woke up. By the time I got to the bedroom, he was already sitting, waiting for me, seeming somewhat sure I would come, yet a bit apprehensive, because I wasn't as quick as I usually am. It was a brief nap, and I could perhaps have bridged it, but in another minute my timer would go off and I'd have to drain the pasta lest it got too done and soggy soft. Regressions are challenging because they upset the order of things. The routine you try to construct or evolve in collaboration with his body. The disruption leaves you with little to no time for yourself. The nap, otherwise punctual, starts to feel elusive because of his resistance. You witness him grow weary and fussy, but his body seems to want to continue to challenge itself. So where you earlier broke for a nap, now you spend time chasing the sweet spot, supporting his body's reluctance to enter into sleep. And childcare then feels relentless and stressful because you witness so many emotions and you're helpless in the face of them. Getting my period makes me more prone to meltdowns myself. The continuing strangeness in my back that is only alleviated when I consciously do not lift Jay makes me feel all the more emotionally exhausted. Yesterday I thought how great it would be if I could reset my body and start over so I could exercise again and draw strength from it. I felt emotional yesterday because Jay turned a year old and was so oblivious to our celebratory mood. He loved seeing my family over video until he wanted to grab them and give them toys he couldn't. This morning, some respite in the form of willingness, even eagerness to nap, frequent yawning, eye rubbing, and thankfully a yielding to sleep. The last 2 mornings, he did exhibit these signs, but our timings were crossed. On Friday, we were between errands, in and out of the car, and in between too many stimulating environments. And while yesterday my brain felt too foggy from period pain to make good decisions about whether to put him for a nap in B's old room or take him for a walk, I think I missed the sweet spot and then had to contend with resistance. I felt so starved yesterday for leisure time and felt resentful against everyone who didn't have to shoulder the immensity of childcare firsthand. In moments like these, I remind myself of this quote I have posted on a nook near my writing desk. Motherhood is an act of defiance in the midst of colonization, ascribed to Dana Erekat, that I found in a book from my shadow library sources called Revolutionary Motherhood. The same source of the poetic lines by Cynthia Devi Oka. Dream backwards, find the umbilical, at least try, that became the preface to my research in the name of the mother, and the idea of trying to locate matrilineal forms of artistic inheritance, which became a way to integrate my long-term thinking around femage and my long-standing fascination with housewifery as a potential form of artistic practice, which to me remains so precisely encapsulated in the sparse lines within the Anne Sexton poem, Housewife. I once read it out to my therapist. Some women marry houses. The final 2 lines are, a woman is her mother, that is the main thing. I recently learned that the Italian word for housewife might be casalinga, and I love it because it sounds to me like something between house tongue and house language, which feels somehow fitting. As I was putting Jay to sleep, nurturing his steady descent, I thought about the idea of kitchen table discourse, because this essay beast feels like something within its realm. I had in mind the image of an overused recipe book, one in which grains of sugar are embossed on and between pages, along with wine and mustard stains that emphasize the solubility of ink. I remember once writing this line, all ink is archival. And I returned to it yesterday because as I was transporting these flashcards, carrying them with me in my new fanny pack, I almost trembled at the sight of the fragility of these ink-inscribed pages. A little splash of water, a tiny accident, and all the words that I felt like inscriptions of time would dissolve into a turquoise morass and would potentially be irretrievable. This is the risk I embrace in my decision to be low-tech, which isn't really a choice, simply the only efficient way for me to move forward with fluency, not allowing myself the indulgence of editing, polishing, chiseling sentences until they radiate poetry. Should I continue or? Okay. That form of writing is more study table than kitchen table. I have until now resisted the urge to make time to write this, because this book, Beast, is a chronicle of milk time, and it is closer to Carrie Mae Weems' Kitchen Table series in its artistic temperament than to Maggie Nelson's Argonauts. How else do you capture the tenacity of lived experience that is overwhelmingly framed by forced resilience, which irrevocably is attached to my encounters with brown jouissance and ecstasy? To enter into a study to write reeks of a luxury, the luxury of isolating oneself from every other situation in order to perform an act you have decided has intrinsic value. So you alter the mode of the everyday in order to make that happen. Ask someone else to perform childcare while you write. But what if I've already exhausted all the options for alternative childcare for the moments when I do in fact need to work in order to sustain our lives, which is every Monday to Thursday, in addition to writing the weekly column for Midday and the monthly one for Stir, other freelance assignments, and from March onwards until June, teaching every Friday at the university and doing my mandated office hours. Trying to milk time is also an enterprise of bringing myself in line with lived time outside my being, asserting the relevance of my subjectivity in every environment I inhabit that deems it trivial, unnecessary, extraneous, indulgent, narcissistic, irrelevant, or not laced enough with expertise. Why is it that when a person of color chooses to somehow record the intricacies of their lived body experience of motherhood, they are seen as either late to the party or not universal enough? Why are Maggie Nelson's or Sarah Manguso's or Deborah Levy's accounts of the queerness and complications of maternal being more prone to validation than mine? Reading Lauren Fournier's dissertation on auto theory as feminist practice felt so significant because of how she acknowledges the genre's origins as being rooted in the discursive traditions of feminists of color. I needed to see this reflected somehow in academic archival ink to satisfy my own long-standing intuitions. I know that when I read I Love Dick for the first time, I felt like I'd been intellectually fucked. It was so phenomenal to read a book that so wholly and unapologetically embraced shame and the shamelessness of writing one's abasement. It felt like Krauss was performing an exorcism, and I often wondered what it could mean to use one's irrepressibility to remedy shame and guilt, which, as a mother, I'm learning, are not innate, rather conditioned emotions. I loved Krauss's book because, like me, she weaponized the epistolary form, casting a viewing of herself against an imagined gaze. Because through the course of the book, we never glean Dick's consciousness or subjectivity. It almost doesn't matter. It's as if Krauss relies on the erasure of Dick's personhood in order to stage the intricacies of her selfhood and being. And this is how Dick comes to represent a patriarchal framework, I think. One of the reasons it has taken me so long to write anything truly extensive that grapples with my consciousness, apart from the work I've had to do on myself as part of self-love and care, is that I never adequately knew how to either defend or explain the narrative gap in a handbook for my lover, my first book, that Margaret and Nilanjana pointed out to me privately. That towards the end, I speak about oscillating between states of being as I try to make sense of PB, the ex-lover, his anger towards me for not doing some assigned task. And then without really allowing the reader in on the how and the why, I elicited some form of mediation or presented a situation in which our conflicts had been magically resolved. Margaret confided in me her opinion of this staging. It was dishonest in a sense, and she wasn't wrong. Except my internalized forced resilience commanded that I metabolize everything about that relationship, even the harm, or perhaps to the point of self-harm. Only later in therapy was I able to unentangle how my patriarchal conditioning predisposed me towards my attraction towards PB and my need to seek validation from him as I saw him or had catalogued him subconsciously as a figure invested with authority, given his immense photographic talent and his brash personality, which I even embraced as consciously alpha male. It seemed somehow compulsive, my relationship with him, like I had to slay him, but first I had to love him. I remember thinking this when I came upon a quote by Louise Bourgeois about how she had to metaphorically kill the father in order to find her true artistic self. Maybe it was somewhat similar for me. So much of my time in therapy was spent trying to forgive myself for my complicity in erasing my selfhood by encouraging prolonged contact and exposure to PB. I tried to examine my sins against myself by demanding accountability from myself because I knew an apology from him would never come. I remember at the time finding solace in listening to Jay-Z's 444 and mentally underlining each mention of the word apologize, each conjugation of it, because I needed to hear the words in order to exorcise all the trauma I allowed to be inflicted. This was perhaps around the time I asked my therapist the soul-altering question: what role did I play in facilitating my own abuse? Jay-Z's 444 filled a need, serving as a template for all the atrocities PB had committed against our love, against me, because of his own patriarchal conditioning. Listening to it was a stand-in for the apology that would never be forthcoming from him, and it helped me to forgive him as well as myself. To engage with this kind of remediation with an absentee party while also holding space for who I was when I wrote Handbook was not always easy. That was the end of week 5.
Now it's my big pleasure to introduce Elizabeth A. Povinelli, that we have had the privilege already to welcome in Innsbruck. She's not only a critical thinker and holding a professorship at the Columbia University as an anthropologist, but she's also part of the Karrabing Film Collective that was part of our Goddesses show, so the second part of this trilogy that Stories of Time also belong to. And within this framework, we had the pleasure to welcome you here already. And let me just show 2 books that we have in our library. And of course, we will be the first buyer also of your essay, Beast, Rosalyn, and it will be also in our library. So we have like The Empire of Love, that we ask best to rethink, or not rethink, but to share with us. And this book, The Inheritance, and we are currently working also, as some of you might know, we have also a record label called TP Records, and we are very proud that our next record will be an audiobook of The Inheritance, and also many nice songs by Sharon Povinelli. So this will come out in the future. Today, let me just maybe also mention, as Beth, you publish so much, I will just point out your last publication, which was published with eFlux, and is called Roots /Worlds. Why did we ask Beth to go back to an earlier book of hers, as she has coined like many relevant terms also, I would say, in the context of time, like you're talking a lot about the ancestral present and everything. But this book was the first book that I read by you, and it really, there are some books who just change your thinking in the long run, and this book was definitely part of them. You start with a very relevant question. You start with asking, how can you bring together, how can you think together 2 sources of knowledges that you are both involved with? One, the queer community, and what the queer community is able to think differently than the, let's say, than a privileged, completely privileged perspective and normative setting. And on the other hand, a very rich indigenous thinking that you are also acknowledges, that you're also involved with your long time, or you are part of the Karrabing family in Australia. She just came actually from there, so a long way to travel here. Thanks for this also. And you ask, how can we, what do you do with these knowledges? How do you bring them together without doing a comparison? And I think this is so crucial also when we think about temporalities, also when we approach different situated knowledges. not to compare, but to discuss them together in differentiation. So we are very curious to hear you best. Big applause.
Thank you. It's great to be here. I'm not sure if anyone here has seen the 1996 Independence Day movie with those aliens. That's what I feel like after listening to Rosalyn, who's so beautiful, and then I fear I'm going to be so please put up with me. I apologize. I am kind of like that. I kind of look like them. Just scary. I'm going to try and keep myself to like 30 minutes so we have time to really chat, which Beth, that means 10 till 3. Okay, hi. It's great to be back. So what I want to do for the next, hopefully, 30 minutes is take up the challenge, take up the invitation that Nina gave me to return to the Empire of Love and for me, engage questions that I laid out there with thinking about the mood of the climate we're in. So with my latter work in particular with geontologies. And in particular, I'm going to talk about love as not an affect, some kind of universal affect that we all share and we can come together around, but rather as an aspect of colonial relationality. And this goes to the issue of how we bring together places. And even that sentence is just so wrong for me because I don't bring them together. They're already brought together. Right? So how do we think about love as part of a colonial relationality? And this is going to take me, as it did in the Empire of Love, into questions about tense, the tense of love, and more particularly, the tense of love as enunciated and experienced on one side, although don't worry, this is all very, formal. It's not just one side, but one side, let's say, of that colonial relation. How do we think about tense event and the mood of love if my purpose is to think about affect in relation to coloniality? I will say really quickly that as I was listening to Rosalyn, I was just like, wow. I mean, it is, you can already see, I do feel like that alien, but there's so much richness that I heard that I think I'm trying to work with in what you were saying. Like 3 things I was thinking when I talked today. 3 things. One, when you said write durationally alongside an event. And that's going to be important to what I'm talking about, although I'm going to use very different language, I think. 2, when you were talking about trying to think through metaphors or concepts of seeding or sedimentation. Oh, sorry, you said fermentation, and I think sedimentation, seeding and sedimentation, but fermentation I think is really wonderful. And then, indeed, the anxiety around thinking about the privilege of having time, right? The desire to have time, the desire not to be in the midst of the anxiety of coming interruption, like I'm going to be interrupted, I'm going to be interrupted. What does that do to the ability to write and, to create, whether creation is artistic or creation is intellectual, they're both creation. And thinking about that this mode of interruption, not as you'll see, hopefully you'll see in my little chat, not as a big event, but little events, like the pasta. Is it going to be really al dente, right? Or is it going to be so soggy, like, it goes in the trash can? But more around little quasi-events, little forms of happening that never break the surface into eventfulness. And the privilege of maybe wanting the time as kind of privileged, but knowing two things. One, and this was really what, I'm just repeating what you're saying, because I want it to sit in the background of what I'm doing, because it's so rich. On the one hand, knowing that all these other aspects of one's life that one could see as interrupting the practice of writing actually enrich it, on the one hand. And on the other hand, although, again, the question is going to be, it enriches it, but what happens when those interruptions are not enriching, but rather just too much, right? So that question is one, which I think is really super important. And the other, which you touch on at the very end, which is, but what's the social space of this privileged form of time? That is, it's a space of self-enclosure and detachment, right? So one might want it, but one thinks, wait a minute, it's not simply time as tickety-tock, but rather a social form. And I think those three aspects of your talk, I would like my few minutes of speaking to be enriched by those thoughts. So I'm putting them out there as the ground. Okay. Now, I thought what I would do is I would begin, and again, I'm going back to Empire of Love, but I'm thinking of it in relation to my contemporary work. I thought I would begin with the tense and eventfulness of not merely discourses of love on the colonizing side of the history of colonialism, but as an affect that I think many people in this room have. I think I have, even though I critique it. That is, I'm not going to begin with love as something independent of social histories, but rather as an affective form that exists in relation to that history, and thus in relation to that history's distribution of possibility, both labor possibility, artistic possibility, ethical possibility, political possibility. So let me break it down, make it really somewhat ridiculously weird. This is love. Love like that. Anyway, so I just want to begin with a linguistic understanding of tense. That is, if we talk about love, we're not talking about the time of love, but we're really talking the tense of love. And for linguists, tense is a particular history of linguistics in which I sit, and someone like Emile Bonveniste and others. Tense emerges from the difference between an event that's being narrated, something I'm talking about, and the act of narration when I'm talking about it. Right? That's pretty much it. Tense emerges between how language allows this difference between what I'm talking about and when I'm talking about it to create this feeling of temporal difference. So in the grammatical past, for instance, the event being narrated is marked as, this is easy, prior to the act of narrating, while in the grammatical tense, grammatical present tense, the event being narrated coincides with the act of narration. Run! Right? Get out of here before we go too deep into this. There's a really nice shop across the street. Languages demonstrate huge variety of ways of configuring this active narration and the narrated event. French does it different than English. Indigenous languages in Australia do it differently from one another, as they are different from English or Romance languages. Someone like Bonveniste noted long ago that, even though there are these differences, all languages always mark tense, right? They always do it. But this is actually not what interests me. Although we're going to see it's hugely important in the tense mood and events of love when we think about love as an artifact of the histories of colonialism. So for me, I'm interested in something that I have called, sorry. So tense. Tense is always then related to eventfulness. All right, so the event being narrated, the act, the event of narration. Right? And you see it, and again, I'm just going to, you can say, that's not me, but I'm just going to suggest, like, these are, if you speak English, I'm interested in German, but I love you. Sorry, I'm looking at you. I hope you don't mind. Here, I'll look at you. I love you. Right? Okay, right? Ooh, that's inappropriate. I loved you. Dare to love. I will love you. Now, I would suggest that even here in these grammatical forms, something weird happens between the first three and the fourth. And now, depending on how you take that will, like in the future, I will love you. I wonder if that makes much sense to us. It makes grammatical sense. But what does it mean to say, I will love you? Right? I will. Am I saying I'm going to force myself to do it? Do we feel that's not quite possible? Right? Is there a difference between I'm going to force myself to love you and I love you? Okay, I'm just leave that there. Because what interests me is not the grammar of love, not what's possible to say or not say in different languages, nor the difference in tense across languages. Amiens, which is the indigenous language many Karrabing speak, Creole, French, German, etc. But I'm interested in the social tense of love. And by this I mean the way in which these strictly grammatical figurations have already been absorbed into discourses, affective attachments, and practices of liberalism, and liberalism as a form that emerged out of the colonial era, E-R-A, E-R-R-O-R. Thus, we could call, I know it's such a bad joke. That's, once again, Beth, be lovely. I often, that's not me, that's that drink. I'm really quite jet lagged. I often substitute the phrase the intimate event for love when I'm speaking of love within this social history or the social tense of colonial love. And what's important is that from the perspective of this colonial history, love / the intimate event is a relational space rather than a thing, an affect, a feeling. What do I mean by that? Oh, doesn't this help? Okay. When I think about love, or when I think about simple, like really simple, is that, yeah, like things we say every day, things we hope for, or some of us hope will happen to us, right? Some of us, some people, measure whether their life is fulfilled, has been fulfilled, depending on whether it happened to them. I never found love. I'm okay. I have a partner. You know, it's a good one, or I have several. They're good. I distribute what I need across them. It's great, right? As opposed to, and then it's question, as opposed to the sense of, oh, I'm missing something, I never had it. I wish I had that thing. What is that? Where does that come from? And what I was trying to argue, and what I tried to show in Empire of Love, is that what feels like an internal desire, an internal compulsion, an internal wish, an internal affective experience, and can be put into language. I'm in love. Oh my God, I'm in love. I never thought it would happen to me. Is an effect of a colonial formation. When I say, and again, just when I'm using love in the way I'm talking about, I use love as a word that connotes a certain kind of affective event. I am continuing, I'm an effect of and continuing this colonial relation. And the colonial relation I'm talking about is this beautiful diagram here that I talk about more in the book and elsewhere, and it's the ideology of the difference between those whose self and economy and affects are organized around that very self-enclosing, societal detaching self. That is, those who say, I should be, I never am, but I should, I feel the should in it. I feel the must. I should be the author of my own, and then fill in the blank. Fill in the blank. And those weird arrows on the right side. It's like of my work, of my creativity, of my affect, and at the center, my love. And this feeling, this subjectively lodged, embodied feeling is necessarily, because it emerged in this way, is necessarily related to a spectral, other kind of subject whose life, love, affects, everything are determined by either a society that explicitly is determining it, like I want to do one thing and it says no, and I have to do that, or people don't even know that they're acting out these socially prescriptive scripts, right? And again, in this little weird diagram, you'll see that there's also a temporal aspect to all of this. That is a self-authoring subject. I need to just think, what do I want to say? What do I want to say? What's my style? Mac, that's my style, unfortunately. What's my style? What life do I want to have? And then I make, compromises, whatever. But that feeling that I should be doing that is also the affective nature of progressive horizonality of liberal capitalism. That where will I go? And it's event-oriented. I want to break it, do it again. New thing, right? And then projected as its opposite are those who are seen as anti-event. They just want to keep everything the same. They're inert. They're past-oriented. And these is a colonial relation. It's the emergence of the West's own, and again, used very broadly, and we can push against that, but the West's own self-understanding of its difference to those who was savagely destroying, extracting material, labor, life, and et cetera. It's a form of legitimation that, unfortunately, I guess, we all participate in. Every time we just say, I love you. Because it's a form of love. If you look, again, suggests in the book, if you analyze it as an affect, it's really interesting. It's like, well, it collapses, because it's not, the autological subject's not real, and the genealogical society is not real. It's a form of governance. It's a governance of self and others. And this, if someone says, it happened. Two things go on in there, and one, I didn't author it. So it seems to go against the autological subject. I didn't choose it. It happened to me. On the other hand, no one forced me to do it. So it's this feeling of the non-truth of both sides of this equation. It's the affective experience of two things. One, the lie of liberalism, and on the other hand, the hold it has on us. Okay. The other thing that, again, in the book I was trying to think about is that whatever we call this thing, love, let's say, or the intimate event, feels and is experienced differently depending on where you are situated in this colonial history. Whether you're situated in the genealogical society from the point of view of the colonizer, or whether you're situated in the position of the colonized. And this is the case in somewhat simple ways. So, say many of my, colleagues in Karrabing, family in Karrabing, will be hanging out with people who are not in, they might be teachers or anthropologists or filmmakers, whoever, someone comes. And it has happened that the question of love comes up. and older or younger or still younger people in Karrabing, folks will describe maybe falling in love, right? Being within this formation, let's say. It happened. Or they will say, I'm hooked up with so-and-so, or I'm not hooked up with so-and-so, just, in the course of yakking. And immediately the question becomes, but what was traditional? What did you have to do before? And it's always in that grammar of have to. So this affect of love has a racial marker to it, has a colonial marker to it. Some people are proper to this form of love, proper to this form of both time as horizontal and the tense of it. And some people can have it, but that kind of marks them as not quite real. So every time this is said, it is said within this framework. Brrr. I also want to suggest that, another really good one, that this form of love as a form of eventfulness lies alongside the Western imaginary or certain Western imaginaries of the political event. And someone like Badiou, I'm forgetting his first name. I can't remember his first name. The guy that wrote the big event book. What is his first name? I can't remember. Alain. Yeah, Alain. I'm not a Badiou person, but, and I'm more than happy to tell you why, but not today. He's the political event, the love event. So he's really interesting. He puts them both in this, there are different grounds to it, but he thinks about the love event in relation to the political event. And indeed, the love event functions, did it happen to me, functions in a very similar way to a certain Western political imaginary of political eventfulness. That is, a thing that happens that resets social time. There was before I loved, there was after I loved. And then if I fall out of love, well, there's after that, right? There was 1968, this is Badiou, there was 1968, I claim that, I have a radical fidelity to that belief, I bracket it. I say it happened. And Badiou, the radical fidelity, someone like Deleuze, radical infidelity to events as ways of getting history to go, but all of them want an event so that time goes forward. Right? And every time they do that, they restage the imaginary of these other societies that do not want time to go forward. They want to be a rock. They want to be inert. And every time they do that, my family colleagues in Karrabing are going to get questioned about, well, have you changed? Now, there's others like Lauren Berlant, me, many others, who have been thinking about, and this again goes back to Rosalyn, thinking about other kinds of non-event, language please, non-event happening-ishes, quasi-events, Deleuze would be intensities that never get to the surface of eventful, that are as important, if not more so, to the maintenance of structures of racialized settler colonialism. So while the West is running around trying to get the event, right, what we see in many other places, and I think it was reflecting what you're saying, is just this stuff that you can't even point to. It's like the water's boiling, it's gendered and et cetera. The water's boiling, I have slightly different color skin, I'm stuck in this thing, I can't pay my bill, but I can kind of pay it if I do 17 jobs. But it's never an event, right? It's just all these little things that add up and means a certain kind of traction you can never get enough traction to do what you need to do, right? Or like William James, have the concept you need to critique what's going on with you, right? And this little goofy picture that I did years ago was it's around the Karrabing Film Collective. It tries to show the artificiality or the wrongfulness of this notion of event, and these lines are these events that have that. You can say, well, that was an event. But in fact, what we continually see, and I'll come back to this, what we continually see is all the little sedimentations, the effort of keeping a certain practice in a certain shape that not only subtend, but are the, pardon me, the real conditions of whether or not something goes forward and remains. Goes forward and remains. I would have just gone on and on about how this relates to how I think about geontopower, which it does. This is from the Geontology's book. Needless, I just say very quickly that this idea of the autological subject, that is this Western subject that separates itself from all history and all other forms of sociality by claiming that it's oriented toward a future perfect, that it's dynamic, that it's innovative, that it's interested in constant event happenings, is embedded in the concept of life. It is what we think life is. And its spectral other, it's the way it governs others. The way it governs itself is the autological. The way it tries to govern others is through the past perfect, the inert, the repetitive, which is at heart what the West thinks non-life is. So part of the question, and turning now toward the end, because Nina said we're going to suggest maybe an otherwise to some of this. What's the other of this other? And here's a rigori. Good old loose, right? If woman is just man, not man, man, what's the other? And the autological society is definitely a fiction that's a spectral projection of another fiction, that it's the autological subject. Then what might be the other to this self and other? Well, there you go. There it is, right there. No. So one of the things I've been thinking of course, for a while is at least me mentally diagramming what these two sides politically and affectively might look at. And again, those strange green parentheses would be indeed the ideological brackets of the autological subject, the genealogical society, or life or non-life, with the colonial desire. And I think I'm part of the ongoing colonialism. I don't think it has ended. It's just sedimenting in different ways and in different languages and registers. For many, a desire to try and align oneself with this intimate effect. If we're talking about try, really, like try. And the various, now technology we have to like either hive off sex with, swipe left, swipe left. I just have like, well, you said fuck, so I say fuck buddies, right? And while we might be still hoping perhaps this event, this intimate event, this love event happens to us, right? And then on the other side, these maneuvers of refusal, of strategies of difference, of remaining foreign to the discourse that is trying to capture them. This, and again, Audra Simpson, the refusal to be that subject in which you're continually interpolated into. Oh, that's interesting. So you have you feel in love with so and so. You found love. But what are you supposed to do? You know, what's your traditions? I.e., that constant pressure to feel yourself as alienated from your own life. And I think when we think about these maneuvers, one of the things we have to do is, this would be, when I say mood, it's modality. What's the possibility of maneuver across these relations? And relations that are not comparative, but instead are sedimentational. And these are some drawings that I did for the Museum of Civilization in Rome, in which you can't really see it, but I'm trying to say you can't work comparatively if what we're looking at is a history of sedimentation, both subjective sedimentation, land, ecological sedimentation, and et cetera. So that it's not the past, but rather, and this is from Down and Argay and Bolzon, instead, what we're standing on is the present form of the past sedimentation. My body is the present form of the sedimentations of these colonial relations of love. That on the one hand, I think, oh, yes, that sounds like this microphone. On the one hand, yeah, part of me was like, oh, I wish that would, well, it happened to me, so now I'm fine. Love happened, great, I'm done, right? But even that is like, an orientation toward a fiction, right? That is an ideological insertion. And at the same time, because of both, because of a certain history I have both to Karrabing, but also to my family's relation to a small village in the Alps in Trentino, where in fitting village style, there was a lot of arranged marriage, and indeed my grandfather was taken back as an arranged marriage with my grandmother, right? And how do we think about that as completely wonderful and viable, and perhaps not better, but how do we think about these in the complex relations they're in? But to end, I suppose, this big, broad, rambling talk, I have also been thinking what would be the other of this idea that there are some who are forced or don't even realize they're being forced to do something, and those of us who are, those people who are like rightfully trying to author their own lives or something like that. What would be the other to the other of that? And one would be to start thinking about sedimentation and differential sedimentation. Another would be to take a strange word or an unexpected word, or maybe too overly expected word, and put it in relation to this love event. And for a while I've been thinking about obligation. That is, I find myself having to do something. I don't choose it. It's not a choice. I find myself obligated. That's why I kind of like it. I want to do X, but I find that I either can't, or I don't want to do X, and I find myself keeping on doing it. And that obligation could be I don't want to participate in this intimate event as part of this colonial relation, but I find myself doing it anyways. And there are a couple of things why I like this obligation thing, because it forces us out of the ideology of this auto-performative subject, this I, I as the author, within constraints and compromise and whatever, but as an orientation. And it turns to a certain kind of determination, but not the kind of determination cast onto the genealogical society as this. Instead, it acknowledges that I am nothing but a sedimentation of these relational histories, something like Glissant would have noted. And this sedimentational relation, like it's sedimented into me, I am the effect of this sedimentation, is always in a stress-strain relationship, right, with its surroundings, whether or not it's because you're with others who move differently, or you're with yourself and you realize that this ideology is not true. You're in a stress-strain relationship. And finally, that the question is not simply whether you are or not obligated, like I find myself obligated, but rather, that is, I find myself the habitus of, within the habitus of these colonial relations. But rather, the real political question is not that I'm obligated or that I'm not obligated, but how I act on that obligation. Do I find myself obligated and I think, ooh, no, I don't think I want to be obligated like that. But I understand that this is not about choice. This is about the slow de-sedimentation, re-sedimentation of not myself, but the relationality that's been set up in the world. I'm not talking about myself and my other. I'm talking about the distribution of possibilities, labor, affect, life, ecologies, that have been swallowed up in liberal capitalism. I'm talking about whether or not it matters a whit whether I find love, and matters more that I reinforce an obligation to change the direction of the extraction of life, of affect, of epistemology, of ecologies, from colonial spaces into the affluent North. What matters to me is that I somehow make that obligation more compelling than the question of will I, should I, dare I love. Thank you.
Before we start the last round, so. Okay. So now I'm very curious, and somehow I feel that you are full of things that you want to say to each other. So I don't even know if I don't really feel like channeling you in this.
Can I have a question?
Yeah.
Do you have your microphone?
Yeah,
So,
I
you know,
do.
I was totally taken up with both how you framed your writing and then the content of the writing. And in particular, you know, the first thing that I was noticing, which was how do you write durationally alongside an event? And I guess I want to hear more about that durational, because one of the things that, not in Empire, I don't think, I can't remember anything, but in economies, I was also trying to think, again, not time in this abstract, but the matter, the materiality, the sedimentation. And I was working with the endurant, because it's like durational in like matter. So I was hoping maybe you'd talk a little more about that.
Sure. This was something that I noticed that I started doing when I didn't start doing, but I noticed that every time I was in New Delhi and I had to apply for a visa, for example, to come to Europe, I would be filled with so much anxiety because you, again, depending on the color of your passport, you have to go through different kinds of waiting. And as a single woman at the time, who was a freelancer, to constantly show that I had enough funds, and I was usually invited to come over here. So it was just a long process that involved me having to build a dossier, with my bank statements, my financial status, like my entire itinerary, everything had to be planned. And even when you do that, you don't know if you're going to be rejected or not because you are a single woman, that horrible thing. So you might go and snatch a European man, which I ended up doing, not intentionally, but yeah.
Is he here today? I will love you.
But what happened was, often I found whenever I would be anxious and I had to wait another day and another day, I found it calming to do something so that I could be alongside something else. So I would often ferment. I would put a sourdough starter to ferment over 14 days. Or I would take mustard seeds and put it in a pot. And mustard seeds grow really quickly. You put it in a pot one day, in 2 days, you start to see the shoots come out. In like 3 days, it's like even more. In a few days, there's flowers, there's leaves. You can eat it. You can make salads out of it. It's so immediate. But if you want something slower, then you can ferment like rice and a little bit of lentil, and you can make these rice pancakes and stuff. So I found that when I would wake up the next morning, I would be excited to go to the kitchen and see the thing bubbling. Like the sourdough would like really rise to the surface. It was just like so animated. I think that was what it kind of made me experience time differently. And I think I thought it could be a very interesting device, to write alongside something happening and just to alter the experience of time in your body by attuning it, to another kind of form of matter. That's kind of where this began. But at the same time, I found that when I was actually like gestating, when I was pregnant, and that was when I was in Innsbruck a lot because I was here on the residency at Kunsthalle Wixenhausen, I was not able to write so much because I was anticipating. And I was anticipating the unknown, because I had spent so many years of my life thinking that I would never be a mother because I wanted to resist the fact that it was seen as something biologically, related to me. It's like, oh, you are a woman. Of course you're going to be a mother. Of course you're going to want children, And the only way to kind of the only other I could find to that was to say, no, I reject motherhood. So, and then suddenly I found myself in a position where I was embracing the decision, but I needed to know that this was my decision that I was making. It was not something outside of me. It was not forces. It was like I wanted to know that I wanted this to happen, So having that choice and agency. But during the duration of my pregnancy, because I just didn't know how my life was going to change, I could not anticipate the future. I was not able to write, which is interesting because I was like this mother, because I had this thing inside me, and I kept clinging to this beautiful articulation that Rossi Bredotti has, the placental, the placenta as this thing that helps create or mediates between the maternal body and the fetus, and kind of prevents the body from eliminating it. So it actually creates, it's like an organ that only grows during that moment in order to nurture a relationship so that the maternal body doesn't see the fetus as a hostile being within it, right? And she talks about the I forget the term that Rossi Bredotti uses, but I started thinking about all of these things, and I think after pregnancy, after delivery, and dealing with motherhood, I suddenly felt like my subjectivity had returned in a certain way, even though I could no longer be singular, even though I still don't know what it is like to have my child not around me. It's a weird feeling, you know? So I think in this kind of entangling the self, even during therapy, my therapist was constantly trying to orient me towards thinking of myself, and I kept telling her, but how do I think of myself without thinking of all these relationalities, you know?
And why? It's as if you can't have a self if you're in these sets of, if your self is not yours. That's right. If it's not yours, then you don't have one, which is, for me, theoretically and socially, insane, right? I mean, in simple ways, since we're talking about families and generations, one of the things that I would say I know is that I didn't produce kids, but I have a lot of kids, and now I have great grandkids. This is a common phrase, they make you a parent, they make you a grandparent. Now, great grandkids we call sisters and brothers in Karrabing. It's the kinship system. So, but it's a whole different kind of sister or brother thing. And literally you're made by them. Yeah. And I would, honestly, I would never try and find my real self in that, because that is my part and parcel of the complexity of, quote, what I am, i.e. who I am, where I am, is across all of those, right? And so in part, I was hearing this, like, how do I, in what you were reading, but also what you were saying, is how do I understand that my writing, the form, the content, even the possibility of it, is both, it's irreducibly where, this very segue, where I'm not, right? Where I am is all those places.
Yeah,
where
but I think
I'm the
one
not
of the
of
things
it,
that
yeah.
you said that really spoke to me is also the side of obligation, you know, and I'm coming at it now from, I call myself a twice colonized subject in a certain way, because I am of Goan origin, so I come from Goa, and my mother grew up in Portuguese colonized Goa, so Goa was like, is a place within India that's now a part of India, but for almost 500 years was colonized by the Portuguese. And so when my mom moved from Goa to Mumbai, it was in around 1970 or so, but Goa had only been liberated in 1961 from the Portuguese. So her entire childhood and girlhood, and when she did her nursing, like her schooling as a nurse, was under Portuguese controlled Goa. And my father, on the other hand, grew up in then Bombay, but his family was from Goa, so he was like a first generation, like the first generation from his family to grow up, to be born in Mumbai and to grow up. So he was Goan, but he, you know, had already lost the connection to like the ancestral land. He doesn't even really know like where he is from in Goa, so to speak. So there's all of this background to where I come from, and then I grew up in Mumbai, and inheriting like British schooling system or learning English, but also, going to a college that was started by German Jesuits. So there's all of this kind of, complexity that comes into one's understanding of life. On the other hand, there's also Catholicism, because I grew up Catholic. I had a very religious upbringing. So for me, the language of love it's taken me a very long time to find ways of isolating it from sort of church language, and to kind of find ways of approaching it from a secular perspective. So I think what happens when you grow up in India, where everything is very much community based and everyone is in each other's business all the time, because that's just how it is, you actually do grow up very much with a sense of obligation. It is thrust at you in every moment. It's like, if your parents raised you, it is your duty to take care of them in their old age, no matter, even if they treated you like shit, for example. Or if you had an arranged marriage and your husband is like beating the shit out of you, it's your duty to kind of, take it. So it's really hard to kind of really separate. And so much of feminist work is also about kind of undoing all of these forms of conditioning. And so obligation becomes a really interesting space
No, I yeah.
for that reason,
Well, no, I know, and it's not. And one of the things I try to say, it in itself is not the answer. Oh, now we'll just go for obligation. No, it's for me at least. It's a second, third order kind of issue. And the first is simply to say politics is perhaps the deepest in the spot that many people, anybody only feels sometimes, which is, you go about thinking, well, I'm choosing this, I'm choosing that, I'm not choosing it, this is doing it for me. But there are these moments in which you think, you experience, well, why aren't I doing that? Like that my politics is such, but I find myself unable to, that squirmy, wormy thing, right? And I would say that is our condition. That's the irreducible ground of the social life of subjectivity, right? The ethics and politics are, where did that come from? And that maybe a third order is like, what do I do with this? And therapy is one say ideology of what you do with it, and it comes with a whole set of different, depending which mode you're in, different presuppositions about this or that. But it's also like therapy in anything, it's durational. That is, what we're having to do is the effort of habitusing, right? And so when we're saying the durational, we're saying the reformational, and then enough. And people like Sabah Mahmood, a lot of people were rethinking this. It's like getting a new form so sedimented back into your body that you might experience it, but now it is the thing that you have to do, right? Yeah. And it is like, so Povinelli's come from Corrisolo, and like they come from there. It emerged as a nickname in like the 15th century, and then it became a surname, and then became a clans. So I'm a Seamonos. And I was born in Buffalo, New York, and my father's grandparents came over, and they kept on bringing him back and his brothers and sisters back. But I was born in Buffalo. I was raised in Louisiana from 65 to whenever I left, 1980. And that was like yet another convulsion of American white supremacy around desegregation, civil rights, and et cetera. That's where I grew up. That was my, right? But I also grew up with these grandparents and the paternal side. My father's like, you're from Cortisolo, you're really from Cortisolo. America's good, there's no wars. Because my grandmother's, all her brothers starved during World War I. And my grandfather stayed alive, and the story's, harrowing and all that. So there was this, before I could speak, the obligation to this place I'd never been, right? That in my life, though, that manifested when I, as a finding myself obligated not to Cortisolo, but to Belluen, to Karrabing. Because when I first went there, I was like, oh my God, the way, because we were part of the Carta de Regula system in Trentino, so from 11th century to Napoleon, right? The Vicini self-regulated their area. And even though Napoleon got rid of it, like 1805, whatever, and then the Austrians continued to do it, my grandfather was still like angry. We are the original families and those blah, blah, blahs, and they stole our, very much. But so when I showed up at Belluen in 1984, it felt, and in this indigenous context in which there's so much language about, right? And it felt at home. But, right? So, but, and I felt like, oh, all this obligation to this place. It's like, oh, I'm finding a setting for it. But history had sentimented us differently, right? So that I could say, wow, this is like how my grandparents talk and what they say we have to explore. Oh, no, we're not Italian, we're not Austrian, we're from Cortisolo, and it's different from Pinzo. So very, and Karrabing, this family from Mabuk, this family from Banagat, this family from Banakul, etc. That all may be true, but we'd been apprehended differently in that system of colonialism, right? I'm white. I'm apprehended as an autological subject. My destiny is to be self-determining, blah, blah, blah. They are, and then they're situated there. So together in difference, and then the question is, well, should I just go back and go back and support my traditional ways in the Alps? Or is my obligation to continue as an ally and redirect the forces of accumulation and you feel it, right? So there's obligation in terms of that, like, women should do this and men should do that and white should do this and black should do that and then there are these maneuvers in which you say, how am I situated in this relation? And what do I do? How do I do it? And I just find that a deeper and more real, because it's about reformation, than like, what do I choose or not? Or, yeah.
What would you say? It's such a pity that Wazira could not come. She wanted to come again today. So Wazira Zaminda, who is a professor for history at the Brown University, and she actually talked about this as the time of love, as loving through and with difference. Yes. So, and I think also I also wanted to ask you for the event thing. So I very much agree that duration is more interesting than event. But I also think, so I very much also like the writings of Rashida Phillips, and she talks about this emotional time, African time, which is, exactly. Yes, yeah. So, and she talks about something that Rosalyn just said, like the time before I got pregnant, the time while I was pregnant, the time after since I'm a mother. So Rashida Phillips argues for exactly this event against the calendar of a standard time which thinks of 1 second to be like the other. I think you are not you're not saying the opposite, but I think this event that you are talking about is a very Western kind of event, thinking like something actually happened, so even maybe this duration, this which is in the event that you were pregnant, because it's not one day, is already an, I don't know how we could call it, but I think it's okay to think before and after in a different way than, and never think at the same time that it's closed. So I think the point that you are making, and that I find very important in all time debates, is that the past is not over. Like, don't think that it's over. The obligation comes for, so I think also you're not saying opposite things.
No, but because I would be really interested, because it's the, like, again, I'm always, you know, the habits of mind are no different than the habits of bodies, the habits of language, etc. You work. Before I was pregnant, I've come to know I'm pregnant after I'm pregnant, since we're talking about pregnancy, of which I know nothing. I know a lot, but not in here, anywhere. But I believe that one often knows only afterwards, right? So the event's already happened, which is super interesting. Then you narrow it backwards and say, and there's different ways of doing it, obviously. You can say, you can count, or you can remember, like, did I have sex or didn't have sex, or how much sex did I have, or whatever. See, I'm just showing that I know what I'm talking about. And so that's already interesting. It's like it's already happened before it happened. And then all these ways of understanding the truth of what you never knew you were, because it's always, and then the after is also, because I mean, so many, it's like, yes, it happened. One of my nephews, oh my God, one of my favorite nephews, Gavin Bionamu, thank you, who often travels around. He, for years and years, Gavin, when are you going to give me a new grandchild? You make it if you want it. I'm not suited. But then he hooked up with Nicole, and he's so happy to be. And Nicole got pregnant, and you have to be there, you have to cut the cord. I was like, oh yeah, I totally am, as auntie. And then this day happened in which, this night happened in which it's like, it's okay, it's not happening, we're gonna do it at 6, we'll induce in the morning. And I went upstairs to talk to somebody, I came down, and they're rushing to the hospital. So I'm rushing to the hospital, this is in Darwin, and I get there ahead of Gavin, and I get upstairs, and Nicole's already holding the paper. I said, how did that happen? When did this happen? She said, I couldn't wait anymore. I had it in the corridor. So that was like this funny event that we narrate. But, so it happened, but after you have the baby, you still had the baby. Right, so that's, the having happened was before you knew it happened. Yeah. And after it happened, it's still sedimented in your body. Yeah. What do we do if that's how we think?
I want to intervene here with two things. One is I also work with the Sharjah Art Foundation. I work in their editorial team, and they recently concluded their Biennale, and I love the title that was there this time. It was just thinking historically in the present, and it comes from Okwe Invaser, and it's such a beautiful, powerful way of encapsulating what it means to kind of think about legacies of colonialism, imperialism, you know, thinking historically in the present. But I also want to, you know, talking about like the event and the non-event or the quasi-event. One of the reasons I love Clarice Lispector's book Agua Viva is because I feel like the entire book is composed of what she calls, or at least in the English translation, is called the instant now. And I think that's a really interesting term. And I'm not joking, but throughout the book, she's just like, oh, I was about to be born. I am being born. I will have been born. Like, there's this constantly playing with tense so that there is no moment in which the being is fixed, or the self is static. There's this constant kind of tension, and it's as if the cells are constantly reorganizing themselves, around the person, and I think I like to sometimes think about it like that, because I think so much of this is also, how you register an event. If you do register an event, it has so much to do with your consciousness, right? And so much of our consciousness is also shaped by various legacies or ways of looking or perspectives or the gaze. And sometimes I wonder what it is. Yesterday, for example, I was looking at a video that I made of my child walking at St. Jakob Kirche, which is the church where I got married in Tramin. It's a really beautiful chapel which has these amazing Romanesque frescoes. There's this whole bestiary. It's really fabulous. I love this chapel. And he was kind of walking around the railing, and as I was looking at the video that I made of him at that moment, so I was kind of replaying the video, replaying the moment later, I realized that all the time that I thought he was learning how to walk, he was actually learning how to fall. And it was only after he felt confident enough with his ability to fall that he decided, okay, now I'm going to walk. And then he took the most number of steps at the Andreas Hofer Museum in Mantova, which I'm very embarrassed of.
You can hold it over his head for the rest of his life.
Yeah, it's just like 5 steps. Then he crashed onto the wall that had these drawings of meant for monuments to Andreas Hofer that never happened, or the Italians bombed it, or something or the other always happened to it, so it was really funny in that moment. But for me, somehow him walking is tied in with now all of these different histories. It's tied in with Andreas Hofer and how I've been documenting his monuments, in like Meran, in Innsbruck, in Mantova, and all of these different places. But it's also tied into now the history of Mantova, because that's when he really accelerated his walking efforts. And then on the train back, and then when we finally got home. So I don't know if I can even pick now a moment and say, this is when he first started to walk, because it's this kind of constant and ongoing thing. And I think I really like I even wrote it down, this idea of something brimming to the surface that could have happened but doesn't. And I think sometimes that's what also makes suspense, and creates narration or builds narration. Yeah,
but it goes back. No, I think that's right. In and of itself, it is what, one could just go turn off you can't turn off your language brain. But anyways, it's just I'm stumbling because I was going to say a thing, but I don't believe in things, and so it's just, I'm hopeless. So let's just say it's like that is going on. And it has no value. It has no valuation in and of itself. It just, okay. It could be that kind of thresholdy thing could be mobilized to be suspense. Could like, how exciting will this be, right? It could also be, I can't write because I feel that. I feel like this pot work. And, one of the questions for me is, in a general way, is the difference between those two feelings of thresholdy thing socially distributed. Yeah. So that, it's not absolutely distributed, but socially distributed, but is kind of socially distributed. Yeah. So that when you're talking about filling out the visa, it was so resonant because Belyuen, which is a small community that, it's 40 years later with all the I have the cutest little great-grandkids. But anyways, you know, Angelina Lewis was talking, they wanted to do a promotional film, and she was, you know, she was talking about this other kind of threshold in which, you know, nothing, all this effort to do something, and the structures of law and the structures of colonialism just have made it it just never breaks into an event. And here's where the event could be good. You get your visa. You do it, something happens. And what she was describing is, of course, the structures of racism, colonialism, which you never get your visa. And you do it 1,000 times, and you never get your visa. And you do it 1,000 more times, and you never get your visa for generations and generations and generations. And then, she says, they wonder why indigenous people don't do anything. Yeah. Right? And that's not because there was an event, that's because the threshold never got into the event. Yeah. Right? So it's not like event bad, event good, threshold bad. It's the distribution of their social.
Or could one say it's the relation between event and duration, which is in how you did it in your talk. It was really Western event thing. So if the relation between event and duration, like in your pregnancy case, for example, is sort of differently, or in the emotional time that Rashida Phillips described, then I think we don't get into this Western pitfall.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I think that's right.
I think this is very, it's very interesting to think about it, even when you talk about, you know, like this sort of the social kind of tense of love and all of that. I think this matters so much, I feel, when you think about it in terms of also hope. You know, like what gives you hope and what gives you, and I say this because like I have been living here now for 3 years. This is now, the beginning of my 4th year here. And one of the reasons why, despite, you know, the loneliness, the feeling of like being cut off from my whole social support system, which I built over years, you know, back home, somehow the reason I feel I'm able to persist is because somewhere I knew that back home there was nothing else, nothing left for me, you know. And then when I rethink my life, the fact that I really feel like what I inherited from my parents was an immigrant legacy, you know, and that's why I think of the word immigrant so much, because, you know, people say, oh, it's immigrant when it's a brown person, when it's a white person, it's expat. You know, and this is true in India, you know, whenever you have white people, you're just like, oh, he's an expat, but, you know, someone else is an immigrant. But I've been thinking about what it is to be conditioned into an immigrant mentality, you know, and to carry those become sediments as well, right? But then they've become very active sediments in how you live your life, and they kind of they govern how you mobilize your body, how you mobilize yourself, how you present yourself to others and the world, like, is constant. So yeah, in that sense, it is a question of how do you keep hope, you know? I look at the news back in India every day and I see there's this dystopia that's widening, you know, in terms of like what is happening on the political level, the bubbles that people are choosing to live in, and the like collapse of free speech, you know. And I'm very aware of how it affects me, even if I'm living so far away, you know. And I'm finding myself getting more and more conscious of what I say in public, you know, and how that can come back and hurt me. So I feel like the stakes are always very high, and especially when you're fighting, you know, like historical battles. And I think how you choose to understand what constitutes the event, I think, is so important in terms of how you nurture hope. Yeah.
It's
Can you hold this, because there's a question?
Yeah.
It's not direct, okay.
You know, there are two things I want to say. One, like economies of abandonment. One of the things I was like, I'm against, well, empire, I'm against love. economies, I'm against hope. I'm just a horrible person, right? But two things. One is the sedimentations of immigration, sedimentations of histories of colonialism. As a Povinelli, what got sedimented into us because of this, now these spaces, Corrizola, Pinzola, all the way up, they're really rich. They're ski economies. When my grandparents, no, starvation, right? So they had to leave. They kept the village as they left the village and pushed it in us, but they didn't give, and they did say it was like, America's great, you make money, there's no war, which discounted the whole racial structure, okay. So you could say it was hope, but the affect that they sedimented in us was stubbornness.
I call it forced resilience of a sort.
Yeah, well, we were just as like stubborn as donkeys. Like, you know, Elizabeth, someone tries to like, blah, 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 you just go, you can kill me, but I'm not going anywhere, which it was like, what are you talking about? I don't understand how you can do that, two things. But when I went to Bellevue and over the generations, it's also like, do people have hope? Do we have hope that things will change? Yeah, we talk about it. Do we hope, do we think these, you know, settlers or whites are going to change? No. Why do we keep going? And again, structured differently. It's not immigration. And Cecilia Lewis said it really well. She said stubborn. I mean, because we just got, and the temporality is different, right? Because hope, and again, we talked about it, the Natty, like a bunch of folks, and one of Celia's daughters, she was like, if you have hope, then when it doesn't happen, you just like, you know, you just want to like fall into bed. But if you're stubborn, you know it won't happen, but you're going to do it anyways.
But I have to say one sentence to this. An artist who was in the Stories of Time exhibition, he always says, Ozin Fezabodi is his name, and he said it now with the Iranian Revolution, he said, yeah, hope dies in the end, because, I don't know, it's a saying in German, yeah, die Hoffnung stirbt zuletzt, but in the end, prepare yourself, she dies.
Yeah, but I think that's, oh, see, I keep thinking it's a microphone. But I was giving a talk, and I can't remember who it was, but there was someone, I wish I could remember his name. Names. Are you good with names? But it was like, well, which is true, I'm always critiquing from a particular side of a relationality, right? So I'm always looking at the function of hope from one side of the relationality. That doesn't mean that hope from another side of the relationality. And it might even be that stubbornness is a form of hope from the other side of the relationality. Or it could be stubborn is hope on this side. It just claims it's not, right?
Yeah, there's also another saying by someone whose name I've also forgotten, just like, if I knew the world was going to end tomorrow, I would still plant an apple tree.
Yeah,
right?
I want to go down doing this. Yeah.
Thank you. I have 2 questions for Rosalyn and 2 questions for Elizabeth, and they're all not really related to one another. And I'm also not really actually good at asking questions. I'm more like, I heard you say that, it made me think of that, and like, now what do you think about this that I'm sharing with you now? So the first thing is, you were talking about your artistic practice in relation to the idea of forced resilience. You mentioned freelancing as the only option to be autonomous for the I, and the I being your imagination that is driven by the forced resilience, and the forced resilience is in the face of precarity. And you mentioned, like, someone asked you, what if you had like a stipend? And I'm just awarded a stipend, and it hasn't like hit my account yet, so I don't like have the money to really know what it feels like, but but I do already feel like, whew, like such a weight is lifted that I don't have to like Also, like the anxiety of freelancing is very much similar to the anxiety of visa in the not knowing of like this kind of durational waiting of the next gig, the next project, like what's the next month's gonna be like, and already thinking that I don't have to apply for another open call for the next 6 months is like such a relief. But then there is this thing that you said that actually to not have that creates a sense of like drive. And I used to also say that I'm from Iran originally, and I used to also say that in relation to the contemporary art scene in Iran, that because of the amount of dictatorship and censorship, the creativity is like another level, like the amount of symbolism and metaphorical, abstracted, poetic ways of like expression is very unique because of it. And that's the artist in me, and the activist in me is like, fuck that, like you should just like say whatever you want to say. And like also like right now, or since the revolution, the underground dance scene in Tehran specifically are also saying that we should go underground and like reclaim our right to dance. And like, so yeah, so that specifically I'm thinking about
I have
artistic
just
practice.
one, yeah,
And then,
and I want to say it before I forget. I recently, for book project, was asked to be in dialogue with somebody, to imagine a dialogue around like sharing of knowledge. So I decided to talk to other mothers of color. I wanted to understand like how they nurture their intellectual practice post motherhood, and all of them had recently had children. And I asked them, how has your relationship with time changed, or what has changed the most for you? And they all said, and I totally agree because this happened with me as well, they said, oh, you know what, we became excellent managers of time. Like really, we are so, like everything is on a timetable. See, my child is already back. I was like, sure it's gonna. And one of them said quite beautifully, she said, the sad thing about that is, in order to be creative, you also need to have the space to fail. And I think that is the luxury that a stipend can give you, like being able to audaciously take something on and like suck at it. It's such a privilege. Like sometimes now when I cook something and something goes wrong, I really feel within me this sadness, like, oh, I spent this time doing that. And now sometimes I tell myself, like, if I'm trying to put my child to sleep and he doesn't, and then I feel like, oh, I spent so much time. Now I just tell myself that time is also sacred, and it makes me feel a little bit better. But I think that is how I would look at it. Yeah.
thank you. And I also asked my second question. Um, you mentioned about your writing practice in terms of these weekly dispatches that also like added up to be like this accumulation of this. And it reminded me of, I worked in New York City, I worked at New York Live Arts, and I was an usher. And one of the events that I was ushering for was called Fragments or Lists, Fragments, and Lacunae, and Judith Butler was like acting as a professor reading a theory. Like it was a really cool thing, but it reminded me of this moment. And I am at the process now with my writing. I'm sitting a lot with the idea of fragments because I'm having a really hard time to create articulations and cohesiveness. And I'm also kind of embracing and accepting that whatever it is about my lived experience that is making it seem fragmented is just what it is. Like,
Exactly. That it is a form in itself.
yeah. But at the same time, like the process of writing in fragments is so bizarre and weird. Like I don't know if you also experience that or
It
how it
is
manifests
bizarre for
itself.
me because I write something in 1 week and then I've totally, like everything I was reading today, I just read it 2 days ago and I was like, wow, I didn't even know that I wrote this, like, because I forget, and it's wonderful to kind of forget because it's interesting to see what you return to, the ideas that come back. So, but I think, again, something changes when you, and that's the reason why I included this small anecdote from this performance artist, like what is it about a long durational performance? Like when you just give yourself that time, something changes, something changes in you, something changes in the form, something. So it was actually something a Nigerian refugee said to me outside the supermarket in Tramin where I live, and we were talking about language and moving, and he was laughing at me because I have to learn German, and he just said, you have to give yourself time. And I think that was the most beautiful advice that could come from someone, like who kind of could empathize with my position. You have to give yourself time, It's not like waiting for the world to give you time, but you have to allow yourself that room, I think, to explore. And it has remained with me, especially because I'm like also learning Italian and dealing with German. And some days I speak Urdu, and some days I speak English, and some days it's like a mishmash of everything, And like I keep wondering when is the moment when I will speak Italian, Like for example, I did my bilingual A2 exam. I passed it, but that doesn't mean I'm speaking Italian,
I know
So
this.
what is the moment in which, like, okay, I can say now I speak German because if somebody says something to me, I'm able to respond immediately. Like, okay, I can frame a response. But with Italian, the guy at the train station said, "In which carriage are you in?" And I just needed to say "Questa," and it took me 5 minutes for that to happen. So yeah.
But like just going back to the idea of writing in fragments, do you like find yourself going back to kind of weave things together, or do you also just like leave them
I
be?
don't go back to weave. I go back and I transcribe just so that I have one copy on my laptop because literally this is ink, and just the other day I had a spill and I lost like 5 lines. It's just a blur, So then there is the sense there's the sense that I've written something and I remember, but I also think you have to trust the process and that things are going on in the back of your consciousness as well. So I think then the fragments can become bigger fragments, or they start to connect to other fragments. And that's what I think will happen if you give yourself time. Yeah. Thank you so much.
I have also 2 questions, but now I have to pick one, and I don't know which one to pick. I'm like, um,
Which one? Which one?
which one? I can't choose. I guess I just like selfishly pick this one. I wonder how does your work relate to or differs from Bell Hooks's All About Love?
I was actually going to ask.
Yeah, and I had to go back and like find this quote because it from the moment that you shared "I love you, I loved you, I dare to love you, I will love you," it made me remember this: how different things might be if, rather than saying "I'm in love," we were saying "I've connected with someone in a way that makes me think I'm on the way to knowing love." And yeah, so I also just wanted to.
You know, I went to, so I was I went to Australia after my undergraduate, and I was a philosopher, and then they were engaged in this land claim, and it's a state process, and the state says they have to be represented by a lawyer and anthropologist. So they said, "Would you be a lawyer?" Because there were these, I was like, "Oh, please God, not a lawyer, anything else." And they said, "What about this anthropology thing?" And I was like, "What is that?" And they said, "White people studying us." And I was like, "Oh, God." But they wanted me to, with them, study what we would call liberal governance. But anyway, so I ended up at Yale with my brother, my younger brother, because he knew how to do these things. So we applied together. It was quite strange. All of which is to say, Gloria Watkins was teaching there. And this was when Bell Hooks was Gloria Watkins. So it was a really amazing scene in this extraordinarily elite setting, which I forget how alienated I was until I go back and read those journals, because, I'm fine, but I didn't come from that kind of privilege. But so you had this deconstruction, you had the emergence of queer theory, and then you had this incredible Black Studies Black American Studies department, and Bell Hooks was part of it. So there's no way my thinking could not have been affected. I have been reading more around her engagement, and I can't remember there's a series of essays, and one of them is it's around the gaze, and her engagement around the durational nature of bodily politics, like the coming to find yourself in a particular structure of gaze, then the real work, and she refers back to Fanon and Baldwin, the real work of then having to make this body that you are already, but also not yet. And I think that's what for me, and it's, you know, it's a different, the work is different if you're a brown or black body, if you're a woman in a brown body, if you're trans in a brown or black body, then the kind of work that, like, if you're in a white body, you might have to do the work of changing myself. It's because it's, again, structured differently. And I think that's what, I'm sure that's what, when I was reading that, because I must have, this would be, the would be, if, right? It's the all of what I have to do in order to get to where I am already, but not yet. I mean, it's just, you just go around in a circle in these grammatical phrases, but would I want to be on the planet with bell hooks? Absolutely. Would I want to, even if all I'm doing is repeating what she's doing, I'm happy to repeat it, because it's, you know, that was part of these formative years.
Does somebody else has a question? I would say you are not so far from bell hooks, but you are just, your focus is different. Like, I think
yeah, no, I feel like those old, okay, so there were these sets of older women and men that when I first went to Bellevue, there were, I would hope that their agency structured much, if not my entire life. And I try and say it over and over. I mean, they said, do this. They said, do it in a certain way. I feel obligated to them. I don't want to not be obligated, even though it's very difficult sometimes. I mean, we're all, the obligation different. But what I was invited to do was to, as hard as possible, engage in critique of, let's just, in simple ways, like settler liberalism. And I felt that's the job I was given, that's the job I do. So certainly allied, but I feel like that's my job. And I just do it over and over and over and over and over again, and like some kind of yucky repetition machine. And then I try also to allow space for others to articulate what's the strategies in this other space of the relation.
I think this explains
If that helps.
the difference between you and Wazira, because I think it's not so different in the end. No. Also, what you are saying and what you are saying is not so different, but it's from different perspectives, and they are both.
That's why I like
important.
to think about it is like yeast or a sourdough starter. Because I really think it's like, there are so many things that are fermenting in relation to each other. And like, it's that, I don't think that we're ever independent. Like, I know when I read your essay in More Than Human, it changed something in me, just like when I read Karen Barad's essay in that book, and then suddenly when you have those, like, two different chapter concepts kind of interweaving with you, and you're reading it in that concentrated period of time, it really changes something in you. It alters the something at a cellular level, and I think, I'm sure that, I know for me, these practices are metabolic, it's like you ingest it and and the sedimentation is part of that metabolic, yeah.
And I, for one, am not looking for a concept that will dominate.
Yeah, me either.
It's like,
yeah.
how does this concept
Yeah.
help us see what's there because I'm oriented to change it in a certain way, right? So it's that understanding of concept as what does this do to a set of embodied visualities or something like that.
Yeah.
I think, at least for me, and I hope for the audience, and I hope for you, it changed, my thinking of time changed on the cellular level. So, thank you,
guys.
Rosalyn.
You've changed on a
you,
cellular
Beth.
level just sitting there for this long.
And thank you also to Siddhartha, who, my partner in crime, for the whole series. It will continue. Thank you to the whole team of crime here. And then I just want to point out that we have this exhibition ends end of this week, but you have also the chance to be part of a guided tour by Tekla Kishko, the head of education here, who sits there. This is on Sunday at 3. And then you both also, Sunday. You both also anticipated the next chapter of the trilogy, because all this, I would call it longing, you called it obligation. We talked about sedimentation. This all is part of the second chapter, or the triggering questions are exactly these. Kalt die Wissen, the openings on the 7th of July. I like to say 7.7 at 7 p.m. Yeah, okay, thank you.
Thank you so much.